So it was last October and I was browsing in the metaphysical section of a half-price books, which I'm going to be real is my favourite place in the world.
It's like a trip to the candy store for me, believe it or not.
When I came across a paperback with an eye-catching cover, it was of an apartment and what appeared to be a ghostly apparition. So, me being me, I had to buy it immediately. I had no idea who Pat Montandon was, but I quickly became consumed with her story. It was San Francisco in the late 1960s. And Pat, an attractive young socialite and TV movie host, was locked in mortal combat with a sinister and occult force. This is the story of the deadly haunting of Pat Montandon. Now, I know I'm going to get some comments that I'm not wearing the hat, and can I be real with you? I'm currently grappling with like 96% humidity, and it's not even that hot here. Also, air conditioning in houses is not a thing in England, and I cannot have the fan on while I'm recording this, otherwise you wouldn't even be able to listen to it. So today we are doing no hat, and perhaps this is the beginning of the no hat era. And if you see me sweating throughout this, no you didn't. So to kick things off, I'm going to crack open a can of a hip pop kombucha. This is the apple and elderflower flavour. Let's give it a sniff. Oh, it smells quite nice. The thing about these is they always smell a little bit like apple cider vinegar, but it's fine. Oh, that's good. That is very refreshing. If you're going to San Francisco. Patsy Lou was one of 8 children born to Myrtle and Charles Montandon in Merkel, Texas on December 26, 1928. Her father was a Southern Methodist minister who didn't think too kindly about racial segregation, and in 1936, his church burned to the ground in an apparent act of arson. He suspected the KKK. The family eventually moved to Waurika, Oklahoma, and her father died when Pat was just 14. Fire seemed to haunt Patsy Lou. Just a few years later, she was refilling a 5-gallon kerosene tank in the living room of the family home and had failed to place it back correctly.
It overflowed and the house caught on fire when I lit it. I had run down the street to find a phone and call the fire department, but the house was engulfed in flames before they could get there.
The family relied on the kindness of the local community, and soon they found a new home. Patsy worked odd jobs. She was the bookkeeper at the public service office and a waitress at the Waurika Cafe, before she was eventually offered a job as a model at Neiman Marcus in Dallas. On a trip to California when she was 17, she met a man 10 years her senior, Howard Groves, and they were married on the Hollywood radio show Bride and Groom when she turned 18.
From Hollywood, we present Bride and Groom.
There was trouble from the get-go. Alongside the 10-year age gap and Howard's alleged anti-Semitic views, he expected Pat to adapt to his cookie-cutter mould of a stay-at-home trad wife, and that was a mould that Pat had no intention to fit in. Just a short time into their marriage, Pat was diagnosed with a rare heart condition.
I came to San Francisco to have heart surgery, and there were only 5 places in the United States where it could be done, and one was at UC Hospital in San Francisco.
Pat fell in love with the city, famously saying that San Francisco is poetry, even the hills rhyme. After suffering domestic abuse at the hands of her husband, Pat divorced Howard after 12 years of marriage. She was granted $100 a month for 1 year in the settlement and headed straight to the city by the bay in a purple and white second-hand Chrysler.
I had $400 and a lot of self-confidence. I found my heart in San Francisco.
Pat's confidence all but guaranteed that she'd land on her feet. She got a job working in the financial district, and her heart soon led her to an apartment on the infamous Lombard Street, known across the world for its hair-raising twists and turns. She'd broken free from an abusive marriage and had found herself in the heart of the swinging 60s. She was single and very much ready to mingle.
I was very lonely when I came here. I didn't know anyone, so I started giving parties. Creative parties. I would invite anybody, people that worked with me, the butcher,
about that, actually.
Yeah, anybody who seemed interesting. And the newspapers started writing about my parties. And the next thing that happened was I became, quote, a socialite.
Throughout the 60s, Pat hosted lavish parties that were the talk of the society pages, attracting the attention of Inside Society columnist Joan Woods, who dubbed her the Pearl Mester of San Francisco.
Our hostess for this evening, Miss Pat Montandon.
Hi, I'm Pat Montandon, and I'm really glad you could come to my party.
Esquire magazine listed her among America's leading party givers.
And someone just came in and handed me Esquire magazine. I'm in it. Esquire? I never thought I would be an Esquire or Playboy or any of those. But it's about people who give super style parties, and you'll have to get it and see, because they have a stupid caricature of me. I've never looked like that in my life. I'm right down here someplace looking funny and holding a glass. And I was called the Jet Set Queen, which made me laugh. I couldn't even afford to get on a jet. Right. But this reputation was building.
This building reputation as a high society jet setter culminated in a job as a TV movie host.
Well, the show I remember was the movie. Was that in the late 60s? Or
it was in the middle 60s. Pat's prize movie. Good morning. Welcome to the prize movie. I'm Pat Montandon, your hostess. And I was allowed to be myself. I'd cry with the film. I would talk philosophy. I had like 20 minutes talk time, and it was fun. My priorities then were being successful in my career, having enough money to pay my rent and buy pretty clothes.
Pat was popular. She spoke to her audience directly, and they seemed to love her. She was aspirational yet grounded. She mingled in high society, yet was somehow still relatable.
When you put the oatmeal on, be sure and go upward and outward, and don't forget your neck. And we all need exercise for tone and for muscle conditioning and all that kind of stuff. I'm out of breath from that.
At the height of her daytime movie host reign, she'd receive as many as 100 letters a day from her adoring fans.
You know I have a fan club. I can't get over it. There's a president and a vice president. They had Pat Montandon. Can you see it? I'll put it up like this. Pat Montandon pins. And they also have fan club cards. We'll show that now, okay? It has my picture on the front, and then on the back it has space, put in your name. Is Michael's name? Michael was number 2, and you're number 1.
The ratings soared and the mail poured in, sometimes as many as 75 to 100 letters a day, until I realized I couldn't cope with it.
To help meet the rising demand on Pat's time, she decided to place an ad in the local newspaper.
Help wanted Girl Friday. Friends, secretary, flexible hours, flexible salary, to meet the challenge of the moment.
The replies were sparse. Only 5 people actually applied, and one of them was Mary Lou. Born Mary Louise English in Seattle, 1929, she eventually moved to California and married John E. Ward in June 1955. Theirs was a happy marriage, one that lasted up until John's death 12 years later. Despite having 3 children from previous marriages, Mary Lou felt the need to look after someone in the wake of her husband's death. When she read Pat's ad in the local paper, she saw her chance. Now, Pat was a fan of Mary Lou from the get-go, and they entered into an informal arrangement, and Mary was soon tasked with answering Pat's overflowing tower of letters, and one in particular caught her eye. A self-described lonely, unmarried woman had written in with a strange request. She wanted a love potion, something that would take her from Eleanor Rigby to Jean Gabor, and Mary Lou seemed to know exactly who to ask.
Anton Lavey uses as somewhat of a credo this timeless quote: "Remember, evil backwards spells live." Somehow that never occurred to me.
Just a few years earlier, Anton Lavey had dramatically shaved his head and declared the founding of the Church of Satan.
We believe in all of the lustful thoughts that motivate man, because this is man's natural feeling.
If anyone knew how to make a love potion, surely it'd be their local occult celebrity. It was no secret that Lavey had a little bit of a penchant for attractive blonde women, so when Pat called him up with this bizarre request, he quickly invited both her and Mary Lou into his home. After an extensive tour of the eclectic property, Lavey handed over the recipe as promised.
Lovey sauce, 1 2-ounce jar instant coffee, 1/5 vodka, 1 vanilla bean, 1 1/2-ounce mandrake root, 1/2 cup sugar, 1 cup water. Dissolve coffee, sugar in hot water. Add this to vodka, which has been poured into a crock or jug of ample size to contain all ingredients. Drop vanilla bean and mandrake into jug. Allow to set, stirring occasionally for 1 month. Serve in 1-ounce portions as after-dinner drink or over ice cream. Caution: do not give love object too much, or it will act as a laxative.
As for whether it worked, nobody knows. They say that they sent off this strange prescription but never heard anything back. I hope it didn't hurt the poor guy that ended up drinking it. But rest assured, this wasn't to be Pat Montandon's final foray into the occult. San Francisco in the 60s seemed to be a haven for New Age's, hippies, cult leaders, and the CIA.
Had the grooviest psychedelic high I've ever had. Well, could you tell us about it? Well, I couldn't describe it. It's something you have to experience for yourself.
And Pat didn't want to be left behind in the dirt, so she did what any self-respecting California socialite would do. She threw an astrology party.
What is astrology? Why do 32 million Americans express a belief in it? Simply put, astrology is the forecasting of events on Earth based on the relationship between the stars, the sun, the moon, and the other planets. As above, so below.
Now, Pat's parties were always a lavish affair, and this one was no different. There was a crystal gazer, a palm reader, and an occult orchestra. Now, I don't know what an occult orchestra entails, but I'm going to assume that this is some kind of like stereotypical dress them up in black robes kind of deal. She'd also hired a tarot reader who had shown up late,
wearing a curious costume in green velvet with a great poof of feathers, and had brought an ill-assorted entourage of 3 or 4 people along with him. I concealed my annoyance at his late arrival and the uninvited guests, and settled him down to his appointed place at the dining room table. I now discovered his name and that he regarded his presence as an immense favor to me.
He began to give readings and requested a drink. Ever the gracious host, Pat disappeared into the crowd to get him one, but inevitably got caught up in conversation. She is a party girl, remember. When she finally made her way back to his table 30 minutes later with no drink in her hand, he was bloody furious, and he declared,
"I lay a curse upon you and this house. I do not forget, and I do not forgive. Remember that."
To drive the message home, he supposedly called up the newspapers to complain about how Pat had treated him. She also claimed that he had called her and said,
"I've cursed your place. You're going to have a very unhappy life there. I'll never allow you a moment's peace or happiness."
Now, I've got no idea what Pat actually did to him, if anything at all. Was this really over something as simple as a forgotten drink? Or was Pat not telling us the whole truth? Now, Pat claims that this astrology party happened in 1968. She's very clear about that in The Intruders. She tells us that she put the assistant wanted ad in the newspaper during the 1968 newspaper strike. And she writes that Mary Lou was at the astrology party. She even says that Mary Lou witnessed the tarot reader cursing her. Considering the fact that Pat's parties got written about in the society columns, I decided to go digging, and well, let me just show you. The only astrology party that I could find that matches the description in The Intruders was from May 1964. Joan Woods called it a horoscope party and said that the guests were left wondering about the sudden disappearance of some of the fortune tellers who evidently felt they weren't receiving the proper deference. This feels like an obvious reference to the tarot reader leaving, and if it's true that he called the newspapers, it's not really a surprise that they would include it in their write-up. Now, I can't say categorically that there wasn't an astrology party in 1968, but if there was, it was never written about in any newspaper, and all of Pat's parties were written about in the newspaper. Considering that Pat mentions the tarot reader calling the newspaper to express his disgust, I really think that she's referring to a party that actually happened 4 years earlier, and one that Mary Lou was not present for. Now, I want to be really clear up front before I get everybody in the comments yelling at me for being a debunker. My intent with making this video is not to debunk an inconsequential paperback paranormal book from the 1970s. I'm not interested in proving or disproving the story. But with that being said, I am also someone who thinks that the truth is often more interesting and important. And to me, it seems likely that this curse, if it happened at all, happened in 1964 as opposed to 1968, which means that the timeline of this entire book is off by about 4 years. 2 weeks after the astrology party, Pat was returning to her apartment with her friend Warren Arnold after a day of shopping. She described feeling something strange in the air as they walked up the stairs, and she soon found that her front door was open. The apartment had been ransacked. A 6-foot saber-toothed tiger rug had been stolen, along with mink coats, jewellery and a TV set. In the book, Pat writes that the newspapers covered her burglary. And remember, she places this incident directly after the astrology party in 1968. Now, obviously, being a self-professed newspapers.com addict, I went looking for this report and I found it, but it didn't happen in 1968. The report actually appeared in the San Francisco Examiner on Monday the 9th of January 1967, a whole year earlier. So I'm pretty confident in saying that Pat isn't telling us the whole truth in The Intruders. This era of Pat's life would have been incredibly memorable. In December 1966, just a few weeks before the burglary, she annulled her 36-day marriage to the infamous Melvin Belli.
He seems to live with accolades on the one hand and cries for his suspension on the other. But he remains a fascinating figure, Mr. Melvin Belli.
Throughout his career, he represented a ton of celebrity clients, as well as Jack Ruby and Sirhan Sirhan. And in 1969, he was heavily involved in the Zodiac case.
Does aspirin do you any good? No. Doesn't do any good. Sam gang stuff never did me any good either when I did it.
Why did you want to talk to Mr. Belli, Sam?
I don't want to be hurt.
Melvin Belli is a parapolitical minefield, and I don't have time to get into every strange and suspicious thing that he was connected to. But he did meet Pat Montandon in mid-1966. That's when they're first photographed together. By October of that year, the press were reporting on their marriage in Japan, but by December, apparently it was all over. The ceremony hadn't been properly registered, and Pat managed to get out of the marriage. In her later autobiography, Oh, the Hell of It All, she says that Mel quickly became abusive and threatening, and that's why she wanted to leave the marriage. With that in mind, and remembering that this burglary happened just a few weeks after her marriage was annulled, one could wonder whether they're connected in some way. All we know for sure is that, again, the timeline in The Intruders is off by at least a year. And I'm assuming back in the 1970s, nobody thought that one day a smart-ass YouTuber would come along and make an entire video about how all of the dates are wrong. Which, again, was not my intention with making this video, but alas, here I am. Initially, Pat didn't link the break-in with the tarot reader's curse. She said,
"A series of happenings, some actual, others less tangible, began to shake my confidence."
These less tangible happenings included a sudden coldness in the apartment, her and her cousin Carolyn hearing the song Mockingbird Hill out of nowhere.
Tra-la-la, twiddly-dee-dee, it gives me a thrill to wake up in the morning to the mockingbird's trill.
And her dog, creatively named Dog, beginning to exhibit strange behaviour. He would gnaw at his own fur and whine and bark throughout the night. One night, Pat was awoken at 2:30 a.m. to the sound of footsteps outside her front door. When she finally got the courage to investigate, she discovered a wreath of baling wire covered in dead flowers.
What was happening? Why was my dog suddenly so obviously disturbed? Who could have done this thing tonight? And why the cold, eerie feeling about the house? What was happening to my life?
Pat was becoming increasingly alarmed and on edge, so she reached out to someone who could help her. Fritzy Armstrong was the owner of the Metaphysical Town Hall bookshop, She was an astrologist, and back in the 40s, she was accused of violating the fortune-telling ordinance, an accusation that was eventually overturned. She was involved in the Church of Satan and was also present at the astrology party, the one that had supposedly set all of these bizarre occurrences into motion. Apparently, they'd also affected her. Oh, Pat, dear, I hadn't wanted to tell you, but I've had an awful time since your party. I fell down the steps when I was leaving, hurrying to get to my cab. My leg is badly injured. In fact, the driver had to practically carry me to his cab and then up to my flat. Fritzy quickly got to work on writing Pat a full astrology report that caused even more alarm. When consulting the stars on Pat's home, Fritzy claimed that suicides are strongly indicated and said that vandalism and cruelty were involved, as well as sudden heartaches. According to Fritzy, the ray of Uranus and the strong configuration of Neptune had put Pat into the depths and made her a potential victim. Now, this was all alarming information, but Pat powered on and was soon giving another party. 1968 was the year the Beatles famously met with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the founder of Transcendental Meditation.
So the meditation helps us because we can do more work in less time, get more free time to relax.
Do you, sir, propose to play any active part in the propagation of the transcendental meditation?
We'll do everything we can, anything that's possible. Everything we can.
That same year, he arrived in California to much fanfare.
Oh, Jai Gurudev, Jai Gurudev, Jai Gurudev. Jai Gurudev, Jai Gurudev, Jai Gurudev.
This is the answer. It's the answer for every man who'll try the system. You don't even have to believe it will work. In fact, I was rather skeptical, but it worked.
Eastern mysticism, gurus, and meditation were in the air. The theme had interesting possibilities.
And so Pat got to work on planning a transcendental meditation party, complete with fake gurus and lavish decorations. Even Senator Ted Kennedy showed up. But, according to her recollections in the book, Pat sensed disaster looming, and her hunches were quickly proven correct. Just a few hours into the party, a fire broke out, quickly putting an end to the evening. It was the last party that Pat Montandon ever hosted at 1000 Lombard Street. So once again, I turned to the San Francisco Society pages to see what they had to say about Pat's transcendental party. Apparently, the organising work had begun in April, when Pat sent out a tape-recorded invitation to a transcendental dropout meditation session at her apartment. She sent these out to 500 people. I mean, this woman knew everybody. I cannot overstate it. There's pictures of her with Andy Warhol, and apparently at one point she was even dating Frank Sinatra. Can you even imagine what her address book looked like if she was sending these invitations out to 500 people? And I'm also thinking, like, if I was organising a party, I would struggle to reach 50 people, let alone 500. But then again, I am not a socialite. I'm probably the exact opposite of a socialite. 2 days after the party, Albert Morch wrote a piece in the San Francisco Examiner where he said that the party was okay, but that it ended so soon because the awning outside had caught fire, corroborating Pat's account. It's a very sassy review in the newspaper. A bloody awning caught on fire, and this guy's like, well, the party was okay. Would have been better if it went on longer. There was a fire. This man's very rude. These society people are so rude. So we can confidently say that the fire did happen. However, Pat attributes it to being cursed just a few weeks earlier, which, again, I don't think happened. And I'm sorry, you can crucify me in the comments all you like, call me a debunker, but that's my opinion. Literally every party that Pat Montandon gave was eventually written about, so I just don't see why it's not mentioned anywhere. And that, combined with the fact that we have a written account of an astrology party in 1964, complete with angry professional tarot readers, it just ain't looking good, Pat.
Come up and see me, make me smile.
Still reeling from the fire and the tarot reader's curse, Pat had little time to adjust to her new upstairs neighbours. They had moved in a short time after the meditation party, and although Pat described them as scruffy, she also said,
"Their taste in furniture suggested they were reasonably affluent and presumably responsible."
They had 2 Basenji dogs, and Pat's own pampered pet was wary of them, perhaps for good reason. Over the coming weeks, things took a darker turn. Pat described cigarette butts left in the foyer and a steady stream of dishevelled figures coming to the house. There were loud noises and footsteps that seemed to end at Pat's front door. One night, she completely snapped. She had had enough. So she goes upstairs to confront them. She's like, "Can you keep this bloody noise down?" But instead of curtailing to her request for peace and quiet, they flipped her off. Can you believe it? It was a bit bloody rude, isn't it? I don't know how she went up there. Maybe she went up there like all guns blazing. They were like, "This woman is nuts." The next morning, she said she woke up to obscene drawings and cryptic symbols scrawled on the walls of the foyer. She tried contacting the landlord, and in typical landlord fashion, he wasn't interested. He was like, "They're paying their rent on time. I do not care. You're on your own, love." Then she contacted the police, but they didn't do anything either. At least not until one fateful night, when the situation finally came to a head. While laying in bed, Pat began to notice the beginnings of a large red stain on the ceiling. It began to slowly drip down, staining her bedspread. Was it blood? Paint? Pat didn't know, but she leapt into action, immediately calling the police. They arrived and soon went upstairs. Then, a short while after, they arrested 2 men and a woman. Then, in a strange twist, they invited Pat into the apartment upstairs to have a look around, and she couldn't believe her eyes. She described furniture that had been ritualistically burned in a pile on the balcony, graffiti everywhere, and rotten food smeared on the walls. The red stain had been caused by an overflowing sink in the kitchen, but it didn't appear to be blood. Thank God. She even said that the police found a stash of drugs as well as knives and needles. After the scene had quietened down, Pat tried her best to sleep, but she was soon interrupted by the shrill sound of the doorbell. Someone was outside her front door in the middle of the night, and Pat just knew that it was one of them. Then, at the back of the house, she heard the creak of the wooden footsteps. Someone was there too. It seemed as if she was cornered, and not knowing what to do, she grabbed Dog and huddled down in the darkness of her apartment, watching one of the men outside with a flashlight as they attempted to break in. Luckily for her, a noise on the street disturbed them, and she was soon left alone. She immediately hired a guard from the Burns Detective Agency to sit outside her apartment and keep watch. But even this couldn't keep the intruders away. Is that why it's called the Intruders? 2 days after the incident, she was leaving her apartment when she ran headfirst into what she called a disreputable looking character who delivered her a message.
"We know you're the one who called the cops. We'll get you."
Now again, I searched far and wide for any kind of report that mentioned an arrest on Lombard Street in 1968, and I came up with absolutely nothing that matches the description that Pat gave. Now that's not to say that nothing happened, but I do find it hard to believe that a raid occurred involving a well-known socialite and nobody ever knew about it or wrote about it in the paper. When I was reading this section of the book, it immediately brought to mind images of the Manson family as well as the Process Church. But I have to bear in mind that there were quite a lot of bedraggled hippies and occultists running around San Francisco in those days. It was full up to the bloody brim with them. I did find one interesting news article that on the surface doesn't appear to be related, but it does have some similarities. Carolyn Jablonski lived in an apartment on Lombard Street with her metaphysician husband, William Gallatly. Now bear in mind that Lombard Street is pretty long, and there is no proof that they lived in the same building as Pat. However, The article mentions that they have a dog called Rosie, and she is the very same dog breed that Pat's neighbours had. I also found Carolyn's art to be quite interesting because to an outsider this could look like graffiti or cryptic occult symbols. Now, I'm not saying this is true, but I'm just putting forward a theory. Could it be that Pat had fairly innocuous neighbours and perhaps exaggerated the story? I feel bad even suggesting it, but we already know that she's not a completely reliable narrator. I'm going back to the dates again. I'm so hung up on those bloody dates. But then when I think about it, I start to wonder what the motivations would be to lie about something like this, and there's no proof that she was lying, just a lack of corroborating evidence. And thanks to my friends at Expanding Frontiers Research, we have put in a FOIA request for any arrests at that address in Lombard Street involving Pat Montandon, any disturbances. We're waiting to hear back. These FOIA requests take bloody ages, but if they ever do get back to us with information, I will add it in the comments below. Despite all of the strange events, 1968 was a successful year for Pat's career. She was on the cusp of publishing her first ever book,
How to Be a Party Girl.
And to promote it, she was going to appear on the Pat Michaels Show. A few days before she was due to appear on the show, she'd opened up the TV guide, and what she thought was going to be a run-of-the-mill interview turned out to be anything but.
From party girl to call girl? How far can the party girl go until she becomes a call girl is discussed with TV personality Pat Montandon and a masked anonymous prostitute.
To Pat, this was a clear-cut case of libel, so she filed a lawsuit. Here she was being labelled a call girl when she was nothing of the sort. It was an association that led to lewd telephone calls and harassment. And for Pat, it was even more evidence of the tarot reader's curse. But if I'm being honest, it seemed like almost every bad event was evidence for the tarot reader's curse. But anyway, here she was with a published book and she couldn't even enjoy it. She had to get out of San Francisco, away from that house on Lombard Street and the spectre of the hex. She had to go to New York City.
The New York woman.
The city seemed to be the cure that Pat was looking for. After just a few days, she began to feel better. It was almost as if the curse was lifting. She made time in her busy book-promoting schedule to visit St. Patrick's Cathedral with Mary Lou. Religion was nothing new for Pat, but now she felt like she needed it more than ever to ward off this evil that had entered her life. As she knelt below the statue of St. Michael, the champion of every faithful soul in strife with the powers of evil, she vowed to leave the house on Lombard Street for good. The publicity tour had Pat flying from city to city, but it was a flight from Cleveland to Detroit that stuck firmly in her memory. She'd sat down next to a woman and struck up conversation, and soon enough, Pat was pouring out her heart, telling her all about the woes of the past few months. I'm assuming this woman had a real agony aunt kind of vibe. The woman reassured her, told her that everything would be all right. And as they were getting off the plane, she handed Pat something from her bag. Pat says she just put it in her pocket and forgot about it. Now, if that was me and somebody handed me something, I would look at it straight away. I'd say thank you. But apparently, Pat just put it in her jacket and then jetted off the plane. She might have said thank you, we never know. But still, you're telling me that she didn't even look at what this random person on a plane gave her. I just don't buy it. But apparently, it wasn't until Pat was sitting on a plane back to San Francisco that she remembered that it was in her coat pocket. And when she pulled it out, she realised that it was a small medallion engraved with the outline of none other than Saint Michael. What are the chances of that? Upon returning to San Francisco, Pat realised that moving out of her apartment would be easier said than done. She still had a year and a half on the lease, and breaking it early would be costly. In the early months of 1969, she began dating Alfred Wilsley, a well-known real estate mogul, but the apartment still haunted Pat. She suffered from a lack of sleep and appeared anxious, so much so that Alfred insisted on putting his own telephone line in the apartment so Pat could call him at any hour of the day and vice versa.
As I came to know him better, I appreciated more the feeling of reality he gave me, and especially the sense of security. I felt safe only in his presence. Alfred was my St. Michael.
But Alfred couldn't protect Pat from everything, and she soon found herself run down with what appeared to be the flu. The coughing fits were so intense that she struggled to sleep, so she reached out to her doctor and got herself a prescription for sleeping pills. On a particularly bad night, she had taken cough medication and 3 of the pills, but they only seemed to make it worse. She soon found herself keeled over on the living room floor, clutching the phone in her hand. She'd somehow managed to call her brother, Dr. Carlos Montandon, and the next thing she knew, she was waking up in bed with foggy memories of what had happened. The news of Pat's overdose hit the newspapers. Her brother had called the police and she was taken to Harbour Emergency Hospital, where she was treated. The accounts in the newspapers are pretty much identical to Pat's recollection of events in the Intruders. She actually had walking pneumonia, and it was most likely a cocktail of antibiotics, sleeping pills, and decongestions that had caused her to go into a stupor. But Pat was famous, and when famous people have overdoses and end up in the hospital, people start talking, and it brought Pat a whole heap of unwanted attention. Again, she blamed this on the curse, and apparently so did Alfred. He told her that she had to get out of that house before something even worse happened to her. Putting my debunker hat back on for a second, I just don't understand how a curse from 1964 can be responsible for pneumonia in the winter of 1969, but that's just me. I feel like I say that a lot, but that's just me. So that become like my catchphrase. Good Lord, do you think I could come up with a better catchphrase? But no, apparently it's, but that's just me. Also, again, this makes me wonder about Pat's neighbours. If the emergency services coming out to her address made headline news, then surely a drug bust just a few feet away from her apartment, where everybody goes for these lavish parties, would make the news as well. After the overdose, Pat spent some time in Mexico by herself. She spent her days sleeping, sunbathing, and walking around the local area. She also went to church and wrote letters to Alfred, her very own Archangel Michael. When she eventually came back to the US, things seemed like they were on the up. She picked up the pieces of her career and she eventually married Alfred, and the two flew to Hawaii for a honeymoon celebration. While they were there, they met up with Pat's cousin, Carolyn. Remember, she's the one that heard the music playing in Pat's apartment, the song Mockingbird Hill, and they began to talk about the eerie feelings they had both had on Lombard Street. Pat said that Carolyn seemed restless, and Alfred said that under all of her brightness, Carolyn is a sad girl. When they arrived back in San Francisco, Mary Lou had news. She'd met an Italian man and fallen head over heels in love. Her daughter Jeannie was to be married the next week too, and Mary Lou wanted to give the newlyweds some space, so she asked Pat if she and her son Jimmy could stay at the Lombard Street apartment. And despite thinking that the entire place was cursed, Pat agreed.
Does the house bother you, Mary Lou?
Not at all. We have a full house. Evelyn's home for a change, the new tenants are upstairs, and Jimmy and me. Of course, there are always noises one has to get used to. If you're wondering who Evelyn is, she rented the apartment underneath Pat's, although she was reportedly rarely ever there because she was always travelling. Pat moved into Alfred's penthouse on the top floor of the Summit building on Green Street, and I mean, seriously, look at the views from this apartment. She could even see her old apartment on Lombard Street. It was June 1969, and Pat's party girl to call girl lawsuit was finally underway. Her and Mary Lou reconvened to refresh Pat's memory about what had actually happened. Mary Lou was to be witness for Pat, and in the Intruders, Pat recalls an exchange between them. When are they going to take my deposition? I'm your star witness, you know.
They'll get around to you. These things take time, as you've so often told me.
I know, but they better hurry.
Why?
I don't know, but they better hurry. It was an odd conversation, and over the coming days, Mary Lou seemed frazzled. Pat met with her at the Lombard Street apartment again, and Mary claimed that she had been up all night sorting out Pat's papers and books, seemingly racked with insomnia. While she was at the apartment, Pat noticed that the television set had been moved onto the dresser in the bedroom, obscuring the mirror, but she didn't think much of it at the time. When Pat left the apartment, she had no idea that that would be the last time she'd seen Mary Lou alive. That evening, Pat gave a speech to Mills College on her book, but some of the audience were less than kind. Supposedly, a grey-haired woman had huffed and puffed her way through Pat's speech, and then, when she was leaving, confronted her and called her a variety of nasty names. I won't repeat them here because this is a respectable channel and I have never sworn in my life. Thank you very much. I think she called her a slut.
Somehow I was taken full circle back to the tarot card reader, and the venom in this voice was the same.
It clearly shook Pat up a lot, and when she got home she was desperate to tell Mary Lou about it. But it was late and Alfred told her that she'd probably be asleep. Considering the fact that Pat could see her old apartment from the penthouse windows, she decided to check and she didn't see any lights on. So she assumed that Alfred was right. Mary Lou had been up all night. She was grappling with insomnia and she definitely needed rest. So did Pat after an incredibly stressful evening. So she soon headed to bed. At 4:01 a.m, the shrill noise of the telephone shook both her and Alfred out of their slumber.
Is this Pat Montandon?
Yes.
Are you the lady who lived on Lombard Street?
Yes, what is it?
There was a fire there early this morning. We have a female body. Can you tell me who it is?
Mary Lou, oh my God, no.
Mary Louise Ward died on the 21st of June 1969 in the apartment on 1000 Lombard Street. But despite the fire, her cause of death was left undetermined. She had extensive burns, but the carbon monoxide levels in her blood weren't consistent with her being alive while the fire was taking place. To put it simply, she appeared to have died before the fire even started, but nobody seemed to know how. There was no sign of a break-in, and seemingly no medical reason for why Mary Lou would have passed away before she'd even had a chance to inhale carbon monoxide. She had a minuscule amount of sleeping medicine in her system. They speculated that it was probably from the day before, and her blood alcohol level was consistent with having only one drink. The press initially reported that a smouldering cigarette had caused the fire, but Mary Lou didn't smoke. They later retracted the statement, and the cause of the fire was determined to be electrical. The wiring in the apartment was found to be illegal, and eventually the entire building was rewired. But the tragedy didn't stop with Mary Lou. Within a few months, Pat discovered that both her cousin Carolyn and her former assistant Vera Scott had died of suicide.
My heart was heavy thinking of the three women who had been a part of my life and were now dead. If it hadn't been for Alfred and my new strength in him, I might have been overwhelmed. And but for him too, I undoubtedly would have been the first of the victims.
In The Intruders, these deaths are attributed to the tarot reader's curse. It's not just a series of incredibly harrowing and traumatizing events. It's evidence of something malevolent invading Pat Montandon's life and the lives of people around her. And while that might be so, you could read it as a little self-involved to attribute other people's misfortune to some vague evil entity that supposedly attached itself to you. To be clear, I'm not trying to discount Pat's own experience, but it's easy to attribute all of these things to one moment in time in the attempt to try and make sense of them. Pat and Alfred stayed in San Francisco until 1972, when they decided to take a short vacation to Honolulu. And it was there that Pat met a woman who would help her make sense of the tragedy. Gerri Patton preferred to use the term sensitive over psychic, but in almost every newspaper article she's described as psychic. She was married to an industrial engineer who bankrolled her work into psychic phenomena, and this led to many people rightfully declaring that she wasn't motivated by money. She simply didn't need it. Her gift was clairvoyance, and she practiced something called psychometrizing.
I would say it's the ancient art of object reading. There are two forms. A psychic can read the object itself, or you can read through actual physical contact. You get vibrations. One is called precognition. That means discerning the future. The other is retrocognition, getting vibrations from an object and telling about the past from it.
Pat and Gerri met in a beauty shop in Honolulu, and it wasn't long before Gerri was testing her powers of psychometrizing on one of Pat's rings. She closed both of her eyes, focused her attention on the gold band, and managed to give Pat a detailed description of the apartment on Lombard Street, as well as declaring that a woman had died there, a very clear reference to Mary Lou. When Pat asked if she had any more information, Gerri had nothing. Now remember, it's not like Pat Montandon was living in obscurity. She was a celebrity with a couple of high-profile marriages under her belt, and I've got little doubt that Gerri Patton would have known who she was. The fire at the apartment had been covered in all of the newspapers, so it could be that Gerri Patton was well aware of what had happened. But I will concede that that doesn't explain how Gerri knew the exact layout of the apartment on Lombard Street. For that one, we just have to trust that Pat's telling us the truth, and she did actually get everything right. A year after they met in Hawaii, Pat decided to get back in contact with her and arrange for both her and another psychic, Nick Nocerino, to visit the Lombard Street apartment. Nick was the founder of both the Society of Crystal Skulls International and the Institute of Psychic and Hypnotic Sciences. Basically, he's the guy we've got to thank for crystal skulls.
Nick, Nocerino, please.
Thank you. Hi, can everybody hear me? We do have the only meditation tape in the world on crystal skulls.
Go placidly amid the noise and haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence.
Nick was also an exorcist and claimed to have written his first book on hypnosis at the tender age of 9. I wonder what his parents thought when he came to him and was like, "Mother, father, I have written my first book on hypnosis." I don't know why I did a posh voice for him, he's American. The new residents of the apartment, Phyllis and James Riley, had been smelling smoke, and both of them had commented that there was a strange feeling about the house. It was so bad that they decided to move, but before they did, they were to play host to Gerri and Nick's psychic investigation. It began on a Saturday morning and lasted for around 4 hours. In that time, the following strange events occurred. Gerri claimed to have been almost pushed down the steps. Her and Nick felt scorching hot spots on the walls. Gerri had a dizzy spell on the back porch. And in the bedroom, she leaned against a wall and suddenly began to sweat and complained about being hot. When it was all over, Nick began to recall the emotions he felt while going through the house, and he suddenly burst into tears. He said that he felt himself being pulled down to the bedroom floor, and that he was there with somebody, and he felt depressed, like he didn't care anymore. Nick and Gerri had photographed and taped everything so that they could take it away and analyse it, and they soon sent Pat a full report of the investigation. Upon opening the package, Pat was immediately drawn to the photographs, and she couldn't believe her eyes. There, in one of the photographs, was a ghostly figure of a woman removing something out of a drawer. In other photographs, there were huge swaths of colour, bright lights and deep purples flooded the foyer of the house. These were supposedly indications of violent emotions, but how exactly did they process the photographs? I'll preface this bit by saying I am not a photography expert, so I really do not know whether this is the correct way to produce photographs, but I'm telling you so that in the off chance that a photography expert is watching, you can chime in and let me know your thoughts. According to Nick, all of the film was either Kodak 400 ASA in black and white or Kodak 25 ASA in color. They then boosted the black and white film to 600 ASA and the color to as high as Kodak would recommend. They claimed that it was impossible to have this done through a developing machine, so they set up a team of 3 observers to oversee the development. Frank even claimed that during the first printing of the photographs, one of them smelled smoke in the cellar despite there being no fire. So it's kind of like a phantom scent situation going on. Now, like I said, I'm not a photography expert and we don't actually have any copies of the photographs that they took in Pat's apartment, which I kind of found strange because I would assume that they would be included in this book. If anyone is an expert, feel free to chime in the comments below. In Nick's report to Pat, he claimed to have spent time in many active houses, but he said that this was one of the better ones. He advised her not to spend any time there alone, as it seemed as if the house itself wanted to force its emotions on her, and that wasn't all.
Further, I would suggest that there were 2 people killed here since 1960. I would further suggest that before this, a young lady whose body was being sold or used committed suicide. I would further suggest that another young woman attempted to suicide.
For Pat, this was confirmation that Carolyn and Vera Scott's deaths were somehow connected to the bad energy in the house. But there was more.
May I suggest that you sell or give the ring away, as it has very negative vibrations in it, and if you will excuse my saying, it is not of this world.
Pat doesn't give much explanation in the book, but she does say that the ring was given to her by a man that proved to be a very negative influence in her life. Now, putting my tinfoil hat on for a second and just theorising, I think she was talking about Melvin Belli, but I can't prove it. There's a distinct lack of Melvin Belli mentions in the book, which isn't all that surprising when you think about the kind of man he was and who he was connected to. She probably didn't want to ruffle any feathers. However, if the ring was given to her by him, then that definitely explains the negative vibrations. That man was sus as hell. To sign off, Nick told Pat that he had conducted an exorcism on the building, but maintained that she should keep her distance. Pat ended up showing the photographs to Edgar Mitchell while he was the director of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. She literally knows everybody. He wasn't particularly convinced and told her that it was remarkably easy to distort photographs. So with this in mind, Pat eventually got hold of the negatives, and in a lab-controlled setting, they were able to recreate the blotches of light and the ghostly figure. But again, I haven't seen these photographs, so I can't comment on the validity. All I can say is that blotches of light and shadows aren't proof of the paranormal. But on the other hand, the paranormal is near on impossible to prove and can often be extremely personal and subjective. Take this entire book, for instance. It's not your typical haunted house story, and everything that happens is remarkably earthly. Pat got to work on trying to find out more about the history of the house. She discovered that a former downstairs tenant had indeed died by suicide, and according to some, she had continually played the song Mockingbird Hill, the same one that her and her cousin Carolyn had heard playing. She also managed to get in contact with the upstairs neighbours who were there at the time of Mary Lou's death, and they made some pretty shocking claims. They said that on the night of the fire, they remembered looking down at Pat's apartment below and seeing a window wide open and smoke billowing out.
I felt my face whitening with shock. Here at last I was brought face to face with horror. All my doubts and suspicions rose again to torment me. I remembered that in the report of the coroner's inquest it had been stated that the house had been securely locked, and of course this could not have been so if a window on the north side, away from my bedroom, was open as stated.
Things got even more weird when they claimed that the next day they had returned to their own apartment and discovered that someone had been in there. Whoever it was had taken a chair from the kitchen and placed it in their closet, and they had moved a false ceiling panel. According to the neighbours, the police arrived and told them that the false ceiling had concealed thousands of dollars worth of drugs, and that they had actually had the apartment under surveillance. Again, I went looking for any mention of this in the local news, but I came up with nothing. Pat immediately connected it with her former rowdy neighbours, the ones that had threatened her after she called the cops on them and got them all arrested.
Could the pushers have been keeping watch on the apartment all the time as well? Could they have murdered Mary Lou thinking she was me? Or not caring who she was, as long as they gained access to the apartment? Had they got out again unseen?
Pat needed answers, but there didn't seem to be any. She went to talk to the assistant district attorney about the mysteries of Mary Lou's death, but he just reassured her that the coroner was known for leaving no stone unturned. If he couldn't figure out the cause of death, then nobody could. She also spoke with Inspector David Toshi of the Homicide Division, who told Pat that Mary Lou had locked the bedroom door and was completely alone. It was an admission that somehow was never mentioned at the inquest. Nobody had ever said that the bedroom door was locked. This was new information, but the mystery still remained.
What happened in that bedroom on the night of June 20th, 1969, I still do not know. I pray Mary Lou did not suffer. I remember so many things about her. Her quick sunshine smile and great joy in living, her unique sense of humor, her warmth and sensitivity, and her unselfish loyalty. She was the best friend I ever had. I like to consider this book my gift to her.
One thing that really struck me about this book is how it feels so incredibly non-supernatural until Pat enlists the help of Gerri Patton. There aren't any ghosts, there's no poltergeist-style activity. It's just a series of increasingly awful events, and there's no disputing the trauma that these would have caused. Yes, there are issues with the timeline, and yes, it's my opinion that some details are either deliberately not included or have been exaggerated. But that doesn't mean that the entire book isn't true. I think it's important to just be clear on that. In 1972, Pat won her libel suit against TV Guide and was awarded $151,000 in damages. The press wrote favourably about her, and she was frequently photographed with her husband Al. She'd begun writing the book The Intruders, initially titled The Uninvited, in the early 1970s, and she'd kept in contact with Gerri Patton. In September 1974, Pat invited her to one of her infamous roundtable lunches. It was there that Gerri told the table that Patty Hearst was involved in her own kidnapping by the Symbionese Liberation Army. Perhaps Gerri really was a psychic. Apparently, she also told another guest to put out her cigarette because she already had throat cancer, and the woman actually did have throat cancer. I don't know about you, I'm imagining a real Alison Dubois type situation here.
If my husband ever leaves me, I'm going with him. He will never emotionally fulfill you, ever. Know that.
The book was published on July 14th, 1975, and to coincide with the release, Pat wrote an article for the San Francisco Examiner titled Out of Turmoil Came a Book, where she claimed that in the beginning stages of gathering material for the book, she became stricken by a severe upper respiratory infection that was similar to the one she'd suffered in the apartment. So she got the flu. I don't know about you, but I just feel like getting the flu isn't that shocking, but that's just me. She also claimed that she'd gotten body aches and back pain, and that her menstrual cycle had radically changed. Even her doctor didn't discount the possibility of the paranormal. And then, as soon as she finished the book, she was seemingly back to normal. Now, make of that what you will, but I think it's important to note that she was around 44, 45 at the time, and to me, a lot of that sounds like perimenopause. She also claims that she went for a meal with the newscaster Jim Dunbar, who had seen that the book was coming out. Apparently, he was at the astrology party where the tarot reader had placed his curse, and he supposedly told Pat,
I've never told anyone about this before, except my wife Beth, but I had an acute attack of depression at that party. So severe I had to leave. It was the worst depression I've ever had in my life, and I'm not a gloomy sort of person. I can't explain it. Bad vibes, perhaps? But it was real enough, and I'd hate to have it happen again.
Bizarre coincidence or proof of something paranormal? That's really up to you to decide. The book was relatively successful, and a lot of that was probably down to the era in which it was released. The late 60s saw a resurgence of interest in topics like ESP, psychic phenomena, and the supernatural. This was the era of The Exorcist, Ed and Lorraine Warren, and a whole host of paranormal paperbacks, both fiction and non-fiction. Pat's publisher, Fawcett Crest, also published books by Ruth Montgomery and Hans Holzer, so her story of a terrifying confrontation with the supernatural was right at home. The hardcover version of the book had a picture of the apartment and the Golden Gate Bridge, but the paperback version was much more special. It was produced by Varyview International, which was the registered trade name for the first mass-produced printed lenticular products. Basically, an image that has the illusion of depth. You move it and you see another part of the image. The cover to the paperback version uses lenticular printing, and they basically just stuck it to the paperback. I personally think it's a really fun touch, but it does set the reader up with some false expectations. I'll be real, when I picked up this book, I thought I was going to be in for a real kind of schlocky 70s ghost story, but it's really nothing like that. And I keep banging on about this, but everything is very earthly and could indeed have a normal explanation. In the wake of the book's release, there was talk of a film adaptation. Producers even asked her to add a final scene that wrapped everything up nicely. But how could she? There was no explanation for Mary Lou's death, and, if anything, the paranormal element was subjective.
I just told you, it's been optioned for a movie. And in fact, it's already been purchased for a film as of yesterday. Yeah. But I can't believe it after all these years.
The book was optioned multiple times but never made it to production, which I think is a crying shame because there's a ton of potential here. And if any producers are watching and you're interested in a 1970s psychological horror, then may I please offer up my screenwriting abilities. I've said it before on this channel, I've got a master's in screenwriting, I've written a couple of feature films. I am ready to bring the Intruders to life. I can see it now. It's kind of like Love Witch colour palette, Valley of the Dolls vibes meets like Rosemary's Baby. Pat's belief in the paranormal didn't seem to waver. In 1977, her and her husband Al called in Father Miles Riley to perform a private exorcism on their new home, River Meadow Farm in Rutherford. He was the host of a fairly popular TV show called I Believe.
When I was a little boy, I had a belief and a fantasy that the greatest thing in the whole world, especially about marriage, would be to kneel with your wife in the evening and thank God for each other.
And in the 90s, he was accused of sexually assaulting a child. Shocking for a Catholic priest, I know. In the late 70s, her husband Al, her own personal Saint Michael, who had saved her from a terrifying ending, ran off with her best friend Dee Dee Traynor. Pat and Al were divorced in 1980, and eventually their son, Sean Wilsey, wrote a memoir, Oh, the Glory of It All, detailing his tumultuous childhood with both his evil stepmother Dee Dee and his seemingly self-absorbed and extremely wealthy parents, Pat and Al. In the years after the release of The Intruders, Pat seemed to be somewhat reluctant to talk about it. It's barely mentioned in her later memoir, and although people were still interested in the story, it appeared that Pat had moved on.
But the change, I think, has been one of spirituality that's come about the last few years. And let's all reach out and hold the hand of the person next to us and feel that link that keeps us bound together in the same household.
Pat's morning staff meetings begin with a meditation. She talks about spirituality and inner peace. Today, she'd rather be called a humanitarian than a socialite.
This is a group of children that one determined woman believes can be the salvation of the planet. Pat Montandon has made 8 trips around the world with groups of children trying to take their message of peace to world leaders, trying to accomplish what eludes even diplomats.
Jan, I had a dream. It was a nightmare, and I was so horrified by it because the whole world had become a Holocaust in my dream. And 2 children were the survivors, and they were surviving in a world in which no one would wish to survive.
Pat awoke from that dream and started Children as the Peacemakers. She went on to meet with 23 world leaders, China's Premier Zhao, Indira Gandhi, Chancellor Kohl of West Germany, and Prime Minister Begin, to name but a few.
Very good, Louise. Peaceful peace.
While heads of state know her today as a crusader for peace, detractors remember only her past as a society party girl, surviving a messy divorce, living in a spectacular San Francisco penthouse, a penthouse that she has mortgaged twice to finance peacemakers.
I mean, I understand you have poured now $1 million into Children as Peacemakers.
Well, I don't like to use the word poured.
Okay.
I have supported it with the energy that money supplies.
She would later be immortalized in fiction by Armistead Maupin in his Tales of the City books, and later played by Mary Kay Place in the TV miniseries.
What is your name?
Giroux. Prue Giroux.
Pat is now 95 years old. And as far as I know, she hasn't spoken about the Intruders for years. I doubt she ever will again. Even though I've got some justified skepticism about the story Pat tells us in the book, it's still a fascinating and somewhat grounded tale of a supernatural experience, and one that definitely deserves to be remembered.
They say you only regret the things you haven't done, not the things you have done. And I suppose if I were to change anything at all, it'd be I'd do even more. I'd take more chances. Serena, I know you like to cry. So, but here's mainly to love and laughter.
Okay.
Cheers. Cheers.
Thank you for watching the video. These videos are made possible by my supporters on Patreon. There's a bunch of different tiers. We've set up a Discord server now, and there's some interesting conversations going on there, all kind of different things about cults, conspiracies, UFOs, the paranormal. Also on Patreon, you will get some exclusive videos and exclusive audio content. I also seek my patrons' advice on thumbnails, video topics, etc. And you also get early access to videos. So if you've enjoyed watching this video and you would like to support my channel and help me grow this further, then please consider being a patron. Anyway, I'm going to go eat something because it is 5:50 p.m. and I haven't eaten all day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!